Good morning. It is good to see you. My name is Bob, one of the pastors here, and grateful to be back. We were on vacation in the last couple weeks, and it's always good to come home. So welcome to all of you in Dillsburg and the sanctuary and here in this space and those online. We're grateful to get to join together in worship. As we were on vacation, my wife, in her brilliance, set up for the very first day of our vacation, a day where we had nothing to do. That sounded great leaving, but then I got there and realized I have a hard time when there's nothing to do. I mean, other than relax and sit there and read and look at animals and birds. And that was a good 2 hours. And then I had the rest of the day. And through that time, God began to just speak, I think, in not audible ways, but just internally. Say, Bob, there's something that I want you to learn in this space of there being not a lot of activity, because this is a consistent theme of your life. You are busy. You have a lot going on, a lot of things to do, and by that you feel accomplished, and that's where your value's found, and a lot of things that I kind of know about myself, but they're not great things to have put in a mirror to reflect on. And then I started thinking about situations. This is one that came to mind as I was sitting there with nothing to do, feeling like I should be doing something. I was thinking about in my sophomore year of college, I was an RA at the university I was at, and part of the RA training was that we did some team building activities for all the RAs, and we went water skiing. I found out about myself that I can usually pick up most sports that have a ball involved or something that doesn't require anything on my feet. But as soon as you put something on my feet, my brain doesn't connect with how to use the things stuck on my feet. And so when we were water skiing, I just found myself face planting continually into the water. Or if you have water skied, you might also know the feeling of them going to pull you up, but you can't quite stand up, and your shorts just get full of water over and over, and buckets of water. But I'm only thankful that it's pushing this way and not this way, right? Because that's what the feeling is. It's like, oh, this is miserable. And what I realized after I got done with that event, there was another time that I was with my wife's family, and they were water skiing, and I tried to do it there, and didn't go so well either. And they kept saying, it's so easy. All you do is let the boat pull you up. It either can't pull me up or it just pulls me over. You know, like that's what it was. And so eventually I just decided that I would never water ski again. It wasn't worth it. The fun wasn't there. And I thought, if I can't get good at something quickly, I just won't do it. Anybody like that? Like if I can't win, if I can't do something quickly, if it doesn't just naturally happen, then it can't be worth putting the pain and the energy and the effort into. And this is the story that's going through my mind as I'm thinking about sitting at a place having nothing to do, and God brings this event back to my mind and says, Bob, remember, this is something we're working on because this is kind of contrary to the way that I've created you to be. I've created you that this entire life that you are living after me is a life of continual persevering through hard things so that God can do the work that he wants to do in your life. And you're gonna always have the opportunity to eject because it gets too hard, or it gets too painful, or it gets too frustrating, or it's just not making sense in the moment. There's going to be always these conflicting voices in your mind. And in that quiet space, God just said, Bob, I want you to reconsider. I want you to be thoughtful in the journey that you have given your life to of following me, that you would remember that this is a marathon. And that it's going to take an everyday commitment to do what I've asked you to do, to simply be faithful today, to live the journey well. And there are going to be many opportunities that you'll have to eject from that, but I want you to know it's going to be worth the effort. It'll be worth learning my voice. It'll be worth sitting in the quiet, reflecting on who I am. And this is the very message that we're going to land with today when we think of the story of the patriarchs. That's where we are in our series. The patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When we talk about the patriarchs, those three names are usually the names associated with that concept of these three individuals being the people that God gave a covenant to, that he was going to redeem and restore, give land, bless, use them to proclaim the goodness of God into all the world. And these three were not without their problems. But I've come to realize that one of the things that I love about the Bible of Christianity is that there's not a leaning away from the goofiness of the characters, the failures of the characters, the places where they didn't follow well. It's all in there because they look just like us. They look like our journey, and they look like how we sometimes stumble and go about our ways. But in the bumper we've been using before the sermon part of our service, we've been using Hebrews 12 as a passage that we read through a little bit there. But I want to start our time together moving back one chapter in Hebrews chapter 11. In this chapter, might be known to some of us as the Hall of Faith chapter, where there's a picture of all these people or names being cited of people that were faithful to God, and that because of that, God did good and amazing things through them. And so in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, this is how it starts. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. And I love how this chapter starts because there's a sense that the writer is saying, let's pause right now as the writer is writing to this crowd who is enduring a lot of persecution, a lot of painful activity going on around them. They were being persecuted because they became followers of Jesus, and they were experiencing the pressure and the push and sometimes even death that was occurring for some as they were enduring and working through this. And so all around, all indicators said it's not a wise thing to follow Jesus because your life is going to be more painful than it has to be. But the writer says, here's what the ancients were commended for. All these people that we've built our lives in their shadow. I want to remind you what they lived through. I want to remind you of the faithfulness that they had as they lived their lives. Because when we remember what it required of them to follow after God, then our situation today, the writer would say, is no different. We are asked to continue faithfully persevering after the call of God in our lives, seen specifically through the life of Jesus Christ and his resurrection to this group of people. But he says, here's what made them special. Here's why we remember them. Here's why I'm going to tell you their stories and recall their names, because their faith is something that you can plant your feet on as well. That this is what I'm asking you, church, to consider, that your life would be lived in this same way. Having faith that is confidence, this calm courage, that's what that word means. Calm courage. When everything looks like it's falling apart around you, remember the ancients were commended for their faith, that things did not look like they were going to turn out like what they thought they were going to, but they remained planted and firm, not perfectly. There are a lot of foibles, a lot of mess ups, a lot of side roads they took, but just remember that their legacy was one of common courage, of resolute conviction and confidence in what God had said he would do, because they were assured, and remember, this is what the patriarchs were assured of, that they were going to have a land, that they were going to have descendants, and that they were going to be a blessing. Those three things. But they said, but remember the story, none of that was happening. Remember, over the last number of weeks, we've talked about Abraham, started out Abram and Sarai, and they didn't have a child, and God's promise to them that they would have a child, descendants, land, and blessing didn't seem like it was going to happen. So for all these years, they tried in many different ways for that to happen, and eventually God gives them a son, Isaac. And then last week, Pastor Zach moved us to think about what it was like when Abraham brought his son and placed him on the altar, and this giving up of everything, trusting that God was going to provide. And in that, Isaac became this picture of Abraham's faith of believing that the God who had promised him descendants, land, and to be a blessing was going to be faithful to do it. And this morning, we're going to focus mostly in on Isaac, but if you've been reading through Genesis with us, you'll realize that Genesis 24 to 26, kind of in there, is a little bit of time spent on Isaac, and there's not a lot that gets talked about Isaac. He's kind of a minimum character, kind of in between Abraham and Jacob, who get most of the limelight, and we find this little sliver of space where Isaac shows up. And in Isaac's journey, the same promise is reminded and given to him as well that was given to Abraham, that I'm going to make you fruitful. You're going to multiply. You're going to have land, and you're going to be a blessing to all people. And then we'll spend some more time with Jacob next week in the interesting way that Jacob's story moves toward that same promise, even though he went after it in some really weird ways. And it shows us all together that the story of faith is not a story about the faithfulness of humanity as much as it is a faithfulness of the story of God to humanity. And that is the very same thread that moves through our lives today. You and I continue to lean upon and plant our feet not on our abilities to somehow make God happy. We plant our feet on a God who is faithful always, who never deviates from that. And in his faithfulness, he invites us to join him in his work of seeing all things redeemed and all things healed, and he allows us opportunity to do that. And so the writer of Hebrews reminds this group of people, remember, this is what the ancients were commended for. This is what we remember about them, and this is what we're invited into. And then we're going to skip down to verse 13. He says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. Isn't that fascinating? I started thinking through what this feels like in my life, and I realized that just like learning to water ski, which I've given up all hope of ever learning, that I want things to be accomplished now. I want them to actually be accomplished quickly, and I want to see the results of everything that I put my heart toward. I want to see things flourish, and I want to see things grow, and I want to see people change, and I want to see communities transformed, and I want to see it now. But the whole setting that the writer of Hebrews puts forth and invites us to consider how we even look at these personalities in Scripture that we're looking at is to say, remember what was amazing about them, is that they committed to living their lives faithfully, but they never actually saw it come to fruition. They never actually saw all that we get to see today. They never got to see the promised Messiah that eventually came in Jesus. They never saw any of that. In fact, some of them never even saw the flourishing so that there were multiple generations. They didn't even get to see some of that. They didn't get to see the kings that showed up, and they didn't get to see and hear the prophets who were calling them back to honor God. They didn't see any of those things, but they were faithful with the life that they were given, and what makes them remarkable is that they remained faithful until death. They didn't stop, but they persevered. And so the context of what we're going to look at today is this context, that the writer of Hebrews says, remember that these people that we talk about in the Old Testament, or what we call the Old Testament, these Hebrew people, these patriarchs, these people were faithful. And you're going to read some odd things about them. You're going to see some characteristics and some choices that we go like, oh man, I can't believe they did that. And they, as a cloud of witnesses around us, probably look at us sometimes and go, oh man, I can't believe they did that. Not that they do, but if they could, they do the same. So this morning, I want you to flip all the way back then to Genesis. We're going to be back in Genesis. Oh, before we get there, just to give you a sense, I often remember as I read through Scripture, I have a hard time remembering where everything's at that we're talking about. So I thought, well, just to help my own memory, I help all of our memories, to realize that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're in the Middle East and around Israel in this area, both on the west side and the east side of the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea. And what we're talking about today is this area down here where Isaac is living. Right through here are a group of people called the Philistines, and they become an important group of people throughout the Scriptures. You might remember the Philistines, especially with the story of David and Goliath. That comes in to be an important part. But in this area is where we're going to be focused today. And Isaac, at the beginning of the story of his life, in Genesis chapter 26, this is when he's been born, he's older, and now he's living in this area. There's a repetition that we see show up, and it's around a famine. So you may remember, you may not remember, but in Abraham's story, there was a famine in the land, and Abram had to go and get resources and help. So now another famine hits, and it's Isaac's turn to be the leader during the time of famine. But instead of leaving to go get resources, God says, I want you to just remain where you are. Don't leave. This is the place you're supposed to be. And so it was in this area of where the Philistines were, and there was a particular person named Abimelech. He was the king of the Philistines, and his name becomes important a little bit later. So as he's staying there, which is the very opposite thing that God told Abram to do at the very beginning of Abram's story. Remember? Abram is in Ur, and God says, go, and I'll show you where to go. And Abram goes, and he did what God asked him to do, and he goes to these different places and moves around. He eventually gets help during the famine. Now, instead of Isaac being told to go, Isaac is told to stay. But as he stays, or I'll pick it up in verse 3, so stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and bless you. That's what God tells him. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. And this is the same promise. The same promise is given to Isaac that was given to Abraham, that God was going to give him the same things. He was going to make him bountiful, many, many descendants. There was going to be land that they were going to live in, and he was going to be someone that lived the covenant of God so that all peoples would be blessed. And those three things are just vital to the story of God through the Israelites. As Isaac stays and lives in that promise, what's fascinating about Isaac is Isaac also, he and his wife, Rebekah, are unable to have a child, just like Abraham and Sarah were unable to have a child until they had Isaac. But the interesting thing is that in this story, it gets one verse. That for 20 years they were barren. Isaac prayed for his wife. She eventually has twins. And in one verse, that's all laid there. You go, why is that such an important, or a detail that doesn't seem nearly as important as it did in Abraham's story? Because God has shown himself to be faithful in the barrenness of Abraham and Sarah. Now God is going to show himself to be faithful in the barrenness of Isaac and Rebekah. And it just kind of moves this way that the story is about the faithfulness of God and the things that we might get our minds like wrapped up on of like, how's this going to happen? The writers are saying, just begin to follow the trajectory of the hand of God. He's moving, he's restoring, he's fulfilling everything that he said he's going to fulfill in spite of the people through whom he's going to fulfill it. So eventually, Isaac is there, God proclaims this to him, and then his family begins to multiply. The things he has begin to multiply, eventually to the place that Abimelech, the leader of the Philistines, says, you have way too much here and you're becoming a threat to me. I need you to move. And so eventually Isaac begins to move. There's some stories about some wells that are important, but we don't have time for that today. But eventually in verse 24, as Isaac is faithful to move as God asks him to move, God shows up and says to him, I am the Lord, or I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. And again, God comes into Isaac's life and refers him back to remembering what God said he would do. And God over and over says, I will be faithful. I will not forget you. I won't stop giving you everything that I said I would give you. So this is the very quick story of Isaac. He's kind of wedged in there between this big, expansive description of Abraham and this very long description of Jacob and Esau and the craziness that happens there. And then we have just this little bit that we see about this third or the second of the three patriarchs, Isaac. Other than seeing some of the things that he did that looked a little bit like Abraham did, like he pawned his wife off as a sister. You remember how that was described last week? Pastor Zach kind of gave us a clear picture of that happening. And the same thing happens. He pawns his wife off as his sister until Abimelech sees that they were obviously not brother and sister and says, well, what's going on? And then he confesses that it's his wife. And we go, oh, that was a picture back to what Abraham did too. What was going on? But the whole story of Genesis is fascinating, is that it's not as much about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as it is the story of God who's faithful to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we start playing with that picture and we realize that the culture that we're in today, I would propose, is that we have come to believe that the lives that you and I live are really about us. That when I think about my life, when I think about our lives collectively, there's often a sense that in the United States and Western cultures specifically, that we are so individualistic that it's really hard for us to think about what it is to live in a community of people who live faithfully after the call of God, that it's not as much about any single one of us as it is about the story of God who he's invited all of his people to participate in. But I think this is what the writers of Scripture want us to consider, is that instead of narrowing it down to us just being individuals, there is a sense of what is God calling us, the community of people who have gathered around Jesus Christ, the King and the Savior of our lives. That is the proclamation we make as followers of Jesus, is there's no other reason that all of us would gather together at any particular time other than around Jesus. That is the reason that we're all gathered around today. And that because of Jesus, there is a communal call of God that reminds us of his faithfulness that has been true in the past. That has been true, as the writer of Hebrews says, that we stand confidently at that time of history, standing confidently because of the persecution that was coming against the followers of Jesus, that they were to stand firm and they were to look backwards and say, because God has always been faithful. And I can look at the people who were faithful at that time. I'm going to continue to do the same. I believe that today we look backwards to Hebrews and into Genesis and to every page in between and after. And in those same spaces, we say, you know what? God has always been faithful. Sometimes it's been really hard to see his faithfulness. Sometimes I've needed others to help me see his faithfulness. There are places where I still wonder about his faithfulness. But we are invited to plant our feet in this calm, courageous space of confident faith that God will do what God says he will do, and that we can confidently leave our lives in that place. So the challenge for us, and I want to wrap up by asking us a few places where about this faith part. Because what I've realized in my own life, and sorry, you're my counseling session today. I had to debrief vacation over what God is saying needs to be transformed in my life. You get to be the group of people who get to help me work through that. I'll pay you all later. The hope, though, for all of us, is that God invites us into contemplating, what does it look like for us to live faithfully today? What does it look like for us to plant firmly on the goodness and faithfulness of God, and that he will indeed do what he says he will do, even when we look around and maybe say, it doesn't seem like God is moving. It feels like things might be falling apart. It feels like my life has no meaning. It feels like I have no purpose. It feels like the people that I thought were my friends are no longer my friends. It feels like broken relationships are everywhere that I am. And in the middle of all that chaos, there's the voice of God inviting us to say, will you keep standing? Will you continue to place your feet on this space in quiet confidence, believing that God will be faithful, even as you look around and feel like you are completely abandoned? Because there were moments where Abraham felt like he was completely abandoned. There were moments where Isaac's looking around saying, we have no food, there's no way to get what we need. And God says, just stay still because I will meet you. And Jacob's story, which we'll begin to look at next week, is Jacob has this total abandonment to do whatever Jacob thinks he needs to do to get what Jacob wants. And eventually God has to arrest his attention and say, Jacob, I am going to intervene in your life and give you opportunity to follow after me. And so we ask ourselves these same questions as we say, now faith is confidence in what we hope for, an assurance about what we do not see. And there is a place for us to ask first, how is it that faith shows up when we begin to feel insignificant? Isaac would be the most insignificant, as just by pages given in the Bible, of the patriarchs. But I can tell you, in hundreds and hundreds of conversations over the years, is that I have yet to meet somebody that thinks that they are the most significant person in the world. Almost everybody that I meet, and I ask them, well, what do you do? They'll say something like, well, I'm just a bus driver. Well, I'm just a stay-at-home mom. I'm just a teacher. I'm just and whatever they say after that. And I know many times I've probably just let those go, but I try as much as possible when someone says, I'm just to say there is no just I don't actually say it that way, but that's in my mind. Like, we aren't just us, right? There is significance to every one of us, and someone is looking at us, and someone's life is being transformed by the life that we have. And the sooner we can get to the place of realizing that our lives are not insignificant, we are not insignificant as a community, because we are all reflectors of the glory of God. That every time we stand faithfully with him, reflecting the glory of who he is into our world, people get an opportunity to see the beauty of God. And that has the power to transform everything about who they are and who they understand themselves to be and who they understand God to be in the midst of their lives. It's interesting, right? When something feels insignificant, we don't take very good care of it, do we? But the moment it moves into a place of significance, we spend a lot of time making sure it's cared for in the way that it needs to be cared for. And there are some of us today that in our faith journey, we need to understand that the significance of what God has done in our life is something to be proclaimed and to lived into and held up to be all that it is. There is no one in the midst of all that are hearing today, there is not an insignificant follower of Jesus. And your faith journey of standing firm and confident in who God is in your life is vitally, vitally important. The second question we ask is what does it look like to have faith that is confident when we find ourselves in a pressure cooker? Because here's what is true, is that when we begin to find that our life is kind of caving in or collapsing, or there's grief, or there's pain, it doesn't feel like God is giving us our best life yet. It feels like we're having all kinds of struggles, and maybe they're physical, maybe they're mental, emotional, relational. It could be 1,000 different ways, but we feel like we're in a pressure cooker, and everything in us says that if God were actually God, then I wouldn't be going through this stuff. When the reality of every person that we have ever been given a picture of in the past, anyone I would guess that you would ever talk to that has lived a faithful life after God, they would give you picture after picture, point after point in their life where it was not easy. That if for some reason you're in the middle of a pressure cooker, you have this moment of time where you feel like your life is collapsing on itself, there's so much going on. Today I want to remind you that in that place, God is inviting you to stand with courageous confidence on the faith that he has begun to form in you, the faith that he has called you to, and to say the pressure that you feel right now, you are not alone. There's a community of people that have gone through the same thing you're going through. There's a cloud of witnesses that proclaim that the God that has said he will be with you will be with you. Don't give up. Stand firm in your faith. Stand firm in believing that what is God's good work will come to fruition, no matter how much pressure you feel today. And then lastly, as we stand in faith when we realize the urgency of the time that we're living. I've kind of come to the point of life, maybe this is my midlife crisis. Maybe that's what I need to chalk it all up to. Right? My kids have both graduated from high school. They're going away to college, both of them. It's just going to be my wife having to just deal with me, her third child, for the rest of the time. And we have these moments of life looking different. It's changing. But the thing I've been reminded of is that there is an urgency as I look at my two kids of, have I done everything I could to point them to Jesus? Have I done everything I can in the 18 to 20 years that I've had with them to over and over and over remind them that God is deeply for them and loves them? Have I done everything that I can that when there's hard moments in life that I've said it doesn't add up to just move away from it or to run away from your fears or the pressures or the pains, but instead in that moment allow God to come and walk you through them? Have I done enough to give them a picture of the majesty of God in all things so that as they go along and become adults on their own, that there is a faith that they're going to be able to live in that has been exemplified in my life? There's a ton of urgency that I feel in these moments of God, have I done enough? And there's space when God just says, you have to just rest in being faithful. There's space. Yes, you've not done it all well. I'll be the first to confess that. But continue to be faithful because they need to be able to see it lived out year after year after year of your life with them. And so if you're a young parent, I never thought I'd be old enough to say, if you're a young parent, I'm not there anymore, let me tell you something. And I don't want to be that guy either. But I also do want to remind us, right? There's urgency to the faith that God's called us to. It isn't something that we just say, well, hopefully they'll eventually get it. Well, hopefully eventually it'll happen. But there's a faithfulness to us that says that God has so redesigned my life that I want to lead them to the heart of the Father in heaven who loves them more than I could ever love them. In Deuteronomy, there's this interesting place where it's talking about what parents do with their kids, and they say, talk about the beauty and the goodness of God and his laws and everything that he asks of us everywhere you go. Don't lose a moment. That there's an urgency about your faith. That it isn't something that we just pawn off that it's, well, I just made this individual decision and I keep it in a closet. I said, no, this is something that transforms your thinking. It transforms your motivations. It transforms your actions. Don't forget that there's an urgency around you for people to come to know the faith and the grace and the love of Jesus Christ. Don't forget. Stand firm. There's an urgency. I find it so encouraging that as I read reports and studies around the world that are saying, it seems like there is a rebirth of interest in the spiritual, and particularly the spiritual that hovers over the person of Jesus. I think, wow, a decade ago, it seemed like that was not the direction. It didn't seem like that's where it was going. And it feels like God is doing something underneath the surface of sometimes even what we see reported or talked about. But under the surface, there are people who are coming to ask the deep questions of life. And they've looked everywhere to find the answers and they found it failing. And there's an urgency for those of us who know the love and the grace and the truth of Jesus Christ to say, but I have something I want to share with you. And I want to explain to you a person who loves you more than any that you could ever know. That you would stand firm on the faith that God has instilled deep within you, and that it would bubble out into every corner of your influence, that people might know that there is a reason for the smile on your face. There is reason for the joy that you have. There is reason that even though we face death, there is hope. How is it that happens? Because the faith of God that is proven to be true through generation after generation is calling us to take seriously the need of the world around us and the lives of the people who are looking for something to live faithfully in. And so, church, the beauty of all of this is that the God of our tradition, the God who has made himself known specifically in Jesus Christ, has invited us through his scriptures to continually ask the question, what are we standing on? What is the firm foundation that we believe we're in? And as the writer of Hebrews says, just remember that all around you, it might seem like things are not adding up and you're not seeing the solutions, but the truth is God is working in our midst to bring about those things, to bring about the future that holds him as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And to all of us who will be faithful, to all of us who will stand firm, the glory, the adoration, and the praise will be given to the God who has been faithful to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Bob, to Heather, to Tyler, and Lana. So God, we thank you. We thank you for the faith that you have shown us and revealed to us throughout history. The story of God is a story where you are moving in the hearts and lives of people so that they can live in the faithful encounter of a God who has a reason for our existence, who has a redemptive story that's playing out. Oh God, there's beauty in knowing that we're part of not just the people we look around and see today, but we're part of a people that have moved through centuries and centuries and centuries of faithfulness, who have walked after you. There have been situations in the world where it seems like everyone has forgotten, and yet there was always a remnant. There was always a people that said, no, we're going to stand confidently and faithfully in who God is. And so, Lord, it's my prayer today for us as the community of the Meeting House, that every single one of us, whether this is the first time we've ever bumped into this community or we've been here for decades, oh God, would you revive in us an urgency? Would you remind us of the pressure cookers of life, that we don't lose sight of what you're doing to redeem and restore and renew? And even, God, when we don't see the end result, may we be people who die, who are living by faith. And through that, our deepest prayer is that the world around us would see the hopefulness of a God who has made himself known in the person of Jesus Christ, who has empowered us through the Holy Spirit so that we might live lives of faith, proclaiming and giving glory to the one who's given us life. And it is in your faithful name that we would pray this prayer. Amen.